So in the southern colonies, a predominantly agricultural society developed. In the southern colonies, a predominantly agricultural society developed. Well, what does that mean? Agricultural essentially means that the economy, the E of the ESP, the economy was geared toward uh, growing things, farming. And so that's how most people are going to participate in the economy is through farming. We'll talk about the different people that did. First off, in the southern colonies, life grew up around what we call plantations. Now, the word plantation, when we talk American history, is associated in people's minds with the institution of slavery. But you can use the word plantation without meaning that there were people that were enslaved working it. But in this case, in the South, essentially all of the plantations were owned by white landowners who then enslaved African American people. In the colonies, they are still importing people from Western Africa. What's called the transatlantic slave trade still occurring. And essentially, these plantations are devoted to cash crops. And cash crops are different from what we call staple crops. You don't need to remember that difference for anything we're going to assess on, but it's important to understand. A staple crop is something like a food: corn, wheat, rice, millet, different vegetables and things like that. A cash crop is something that is basically you produce it and you sell it for as high a profit as possible. And the examples of this are tobacco, rice, indigo, and cotton. Those are kind of the four big ones. There's a couple others, but those are the four main ones in the American South. Now, later, leading up to the American Civil War, cotton will become the most profitable one. But it's not that way at this time period. It's there. It is profitable, but it's not, it's not competitively the most important crop. So the plantation owners, they were people who enslaved other people to serve as the labor on those plantations, and those people were virtually all. I wouldn't even, maybe not even virtually, maybe literally all Africans who were brought from West Africa, or people who had been born in the United States, um, who were African Americans. So in the South, the colonies didn't develop a lot of large cities. They're really you have Charleston in South Carolina, and that's pretty much it. All the major cities in the colonies are really in the north, and that's Boston, Philadelphia, and then New York. So plantations were largely about producing these cash crops and then shipping them back to England, more or less. So plantation life in the South basically revolved around enslaved labor. Now, if you look back through history, you'll actually see that prior to the bringing of people to the New World, slavery was actually not racially based the way we would talk about racially based, as in skin color. And in many cases, other historical examples of slavery, the people that were enslaved often were racially and ethnically very similar to the people that enslaved them, and sometimes it might be difficult to tell them apart just ethnically just by looking at them. But there was a reason that people prior to the American colonies, but then into the American colonies, began to import people from Africa, kidnap people from Africa. So what were the motivations? Now, this doesn't make it right. This is not an explanation as to say, well, okay, it made sense. This is the rationale they had for this. First off, it was cheaper than to pay someone or to hire an indentured servant, which was someone who worked for a time in order to arrive in the New World. Black skin was seen as a mark of being inferior, and it also made it impossible for people that were enslaved once they reached the New World to escape in many ways. The people that are kidnapped from Western Africa, they're not going home if they were brought from there. If they were born in the United States, they essentially are the colonies. They essentially are home, but the people that were brought over there, and that's primarily the way people came to the colonies. They're not going home. Previously, the people who colonized the New World had tried to enslave and did enslave local people. The problem was, at least for the enslavers, was that those people, if they escaped, could probably go find another group of people who were still not enslaved, probably spoke a similar language, and kind of escape and hide there. The other problem that the Spanish encountered at first and then really went along later was that in comparison, New World peoples in the Americas, for the most part, when they encountered European diseases like smallpox, they died in large numbers. They had no immunity to it, and they died. Whereas on the other hand, people who lived in Western Africa, for the most part, had encountered a lot of those European diseases and had immunity to them. So they were more likely to survive, at least when it came to disease. So that slavery, including what was called the Atlantic slave trade, which we'll call the Middle Passage, was extraordinarily brutal. And we're going to look at that a little more closely at a later time. Let's see what I got. Okay, great. So now later we'll take a deeper dive on slavery, but I want to kind of set it up. The people that were enslaved didn't just arrive here and just kind of just sort of oh well, accept it. They made lots of uh, had lots of mechanisms for attempting to preserve the culture that they brought with them. It became difficult because in many cases, you're not everybody from, people from West Africa are in different groups of people, different language groups, different cultures, but they attempted to preserve that. For instance, the cultural tradition of the ring shout. These things came over and then were preserved in the cultures of people that were enslaved in the Americas. Many retained skills making a lot of the things. And you'll see this also in a lot of not just the colonies, but also some of the different Caribbean islands. People that came over were able to and held on and preserved as much of their culture as possible. Now, probably the more famous examples of resistance of enslaved people were armed rebellions, but they were really rare. We're going to talk about essentially the most important one when it came to the colonies, which was the Stono Rebellion. But most of the time, people that were enslaved attempted to resist or find ways to make it somewhat more bearable by things that were harder to detect. Faking illness, breaking tools to try to slow down work. All these things were designed to try to resist the brutality of slavery. Now, once there were a large number of people that were enslaved in the New World, what did start to happen was that people did escape and eventually started to form colonies of escaped enslaved people. And often they would be in sort of swampy areas or coastal areas where it was hard for slave catchers to attempt to try to bring somebody back, more or less. Some even were able to find Native American tribes and join them in some way. And so that was another way to escape. So escapes did start to happen. It was just much more difficult. Finally, there was armed rebellion, and the most famous one in the colonies is the Stono Rebellion. There's a little typo there. That should read Stono Rebellion. The Stono was a river in South Carolina. It was a slave rebellion, and basically, essentially every rebellion of people that were enslaved was put down. And it's not, pretty much if somebody started that, they could expect that if they didn't escape in some way, then they were going either back to slavery. I don't want to say if they were lucky, I don't know what's preferable, or they were going to be killed. And this starts with the Stoner Rebellion. A group of Africans who have been brought to South Carolina, probably from the Kingdom of Congo. They armed themselves. They attempted to go from the Stono River in South Carolina, and they were trying to get to Florida, which was then a colony of Spain, on the hopes that the Spanish still had slavery at that point. But I think there was some hope that if they could get there, perhaps they wouldn't be considered enslaved and they could get some form of freedom or something like that. They were unsuccessful, and most were killed or either returned to slavery or sold back into slavery. The end result of this is that the southern colonies, the northern colonies too. This isn't like the southern colonies all had everybody was enslaving people, and in the north everyone was an abolitionist. No, that is not the case. There was slavery in the northern colonies too, just wasn't as widespread. But when those rebellions happened, basically the people in charge essentially decided they came up with ways um, to try to prevent them, making those punishments into law that if you engaged in a rebellion you'd be killed. Um, Coming up with restrictions on what you could teach an enslaved person in terms of reading, writing skills, and things like that. Movement restrictions, and it was, and later will happen that people that were owning other people, not everybody worked in the fields and states. Sometimes they would send people out to do little jobs, but that involved a bit of movement and freedom that later people would tamp down. And so finally, when the American colonies become the American states, those southern states are very much interested in trying to prevent slave rebellions like the Stoner Rebellion. So that was in their memory. Okay, I want to stick to 20 minutes. About 9 minutes left, and we're on the second half. We'll call this the commercial North. Now, again, we're generalizing. We don't mean to say that in the North they didn't have farms. If you'd gone anywhere in the colonies, you'd have said it's pretty agricultural compared to what we think of. But the North, like I said, has three of the four major cities. And so there's much more what we call commerce. This is mostly what we've been talking about is economic today, but also political and social. And the economy of the northern colonies tended to center around trade, raw material production, and a little teeny tiny bit of manufacturing. That's kind of what we mean by commerce. We could almost use the word business, but commerce also means a lot of things like trade. I'm going to make sure you can get that sentence down. Wait till the pencil stop tapping, and then I'll go to the next slide. So in the North, the northern economies were a bit more diverse in terms of what they produce. Remember, in the South, it's primarily plantation-based agriculture, and most of that land is owned by these plantation owners. But in the North, you're seeing something different. The farmers are growing multiple types of crops, and they're smaller family farms. There really aren't what we would call plantations in the North. Part of that, here's that geographic thing we're talking about, is in the North, a lot of the cash crops, the tobacco, the rice, the indigo, the cotton, they don't really grow effectively there. What does grow well up there, if you have good farming land, are a lot of the staple crops, corn, wheat. The corn, corn was a word that was actually imported from Europe. The better word would probably be maize when we refer to corn, because over in Europe they call corn is anything that's like a little kernel. So peppercorns and things like that. Anyway, so the farmers usually grew multiple types of crops. You've got fishing, lumbering, also milling in the New England cities. And you actually, here's the manufacturer, you have some shipbuilding and producing iron. The iron that they're producing, actually, New Jersey has a pretty long tradition of what was called bog iron. Basically, I didn't know you could do this, but apparently you can. You could take a bunch of like swamp water, and there's like iron dissolved in it, and you just have to evaporate it, and you can get iron out of it. I don't know how you do it, but that's how they did it. They've also got some glass making because there's a lot of sand in New Jersey and places like that, and you can turn that silica into glass. So you got glass production. Some of this production is going to the colonies. The glass production that England doesn't want the colonies glass. You can have you make your glass and you keep it. But the fishing and the lumbering, the milling, and the shipbuilding, all of that is benefiting Europe and England. And so where in the South, you essentially the life centers around the plantation. In the North, life centered around cities, and all three of these cities are around water. Boston, has the Massachusetts Bay. Philadelphia has the Delaware River, and New York is kind of situated both on the ocean there and has a channel and a river next to it. And the control of society here is the merchants, not the plantation. There's no plantation owners, but merchants, the ones who control the money and the trade and the banking, they're the ones who really control society. That's a social thing of the ESP. And in the North, okay, when we say diversity, we don't mean anything like that the diversity of the United States today, but you do, especially in Pennsylvania, have a place where lots of people from different backgrounds can live, and especially in Pennsylvania and Philadelphia, can actually be tolerated and accepted. Pennsylvania is really the place, and William Penn, because of his Quaker beliefs, believed that essentially race and ethnicity were meaningless, and everyone had an internal spark that made them one of God's children, and so they should be treated equally. Um, he even believed that, and this was kind of out there for back then, that even everybody that believed in one God should be treated the same, even if they weren't technically Christian. So in Pennsylvania, you've got Germans. Now, there's no Germany yet, the German speaking people. You have Scotch Irish, which is these are people from the northeastern portion of the island of Ireland who were descended from Scots that settled there. Kind of a long story. You have the Dutch, mostly in New York. Scandinavians, really, it says Delaware, but it's really all through the area, especially the Delaware Valley. Swedesboro, for instance, was settled by Swedes. So was Mullica Hill. And also Jews. This was something really out there because in Europe, you've got a pattern where people that were Jewish were run out of towns. They were attacked and killed in pogroms. They often weren't even tolerated in a lot of these places. But when it came to Pennsylvania and Philadelphia, they could live there. So there were some concerns among colonists about what these groups meant for the colonies and for English culture. And what William Penn was doing in Pennsylvania, this kind of experiment, a lot of people thought it was a little bit crazy. Now there was slavery in the North, but it's not as widespread. And here's the generalization. The further south you went, especially moving toward the Civil War, the more likely it was that slave life was very restricted and brutal. And the more northerly you got, the more likely it was to have a little bit more, we're not going to say like freedom because these people were not free, but more rights, protections, maybe privileges in terms of being able to move around. If people were enslaved in the North, they typically were maybe working as house servants. They might have even have picked up some skills and be working, in some small like ironsmithing and things like that. So it was, it was different. Let's put it that way. But there's still slavery in the North. So the impact of the Enlightenment, we've already talked about that with a little bit with our look at Locke and Montesquieu, and I'm just going to try to sum it up quickly, and then I'll talk about the Great Awakening as well, and then I think that's it. So what's impacting a lot of these colonies is this Enlightenment, and this Enlightenment was taking place in this time period, and it was basically a change in the way people thought. A lot of those ideas found their ways to the American colonies. First off, an idea that science could be used to obtain knowledge through reason and experimentation. And we'll see that with Franklin, Thomas Jefferson, and we'll circle back to that. Politically, in the Enlightenment, they would have looked at an object and said, what is an object? What properties does it have? It has mass. It is made of matter. Because it has mass, you had Newton, and okay, it has gravity. It's pulled toward the earth, and okay, it had natural properties, and the universe worked in a mechanical way. God didn't watch every single little thing. He created rules and set the universe in motion. Things fall down not because God decrees it, but because God created a universe with gravity. And that's how they thought about it. So people, they believed, also had natural rights, which we looked at in our reading 2 days ago. And government's purpose, you look at a machine. What's the purpose of back then, like a well, or what's the purpose of a tool like a hammer, or it has a purpose that's related to how it's built. And they believed that the purpose of government was to protect the rights of the people and to allow them to exercise them. And so this is going to lead to a lot of those colonists questioning the British government. Okay, last one is the Great Awakening. Now, later, we're going to compare and contrast the Enlightenment and the Great Awakening because a lot of people get them confused. They both sound like, but I want to differentiate them. The Enlightenment was primarily based around reason and science. It wasn't necessarily against religion. And in fact, a lot of Enlightenment thinkers thought, it was important to have those beliefs, but they thought if you studied science, you'd learn more about God, was kind of their thought. The Great Awakening was primarily religious. And so what's going on in the colonies? All right. People are arriving. We talk about, sometimes we say, why do people come to the colonies? They came for religious freedom, right? Yeah, in a way. In many cases, they came to escape government religious persecution where they came from. But when they arrived, they weren't necessarily like, William Penn's the closest you get to it. They didn't go say, hey, whatever you want to believe is great. Just fine. Just don't mess with anybody. No, not that kind of religious freedom. The religious freedom they wanted was freedom not to be persecuted by somebody else who controlled the government and decided what religion would be for you. So when they arrived, they often set up their own religious tincture to the government and said, oh, okay, now that we're here, our government in this colony, we say we are Anglican, which is the Church of England, or we are Catholic in Maryland. Okay. But once people get there, they begin to start to read their religious text for themselves. We're talking exclusively the Bible here. Different translations of the Bible. Pretty much all of them would have been reading what we call the King James Version. But they begin to read it, and some of them come up with new interpretations. And then they break off and form their own religious church. And they say, okay, all right, we're not going to be a Congregationalist. We're going to go over and do this. Oh, we're not Presbyterian, we're this. And so what you start to get are a splintering of these churches where there's nothing to stop them in a good way. Back if you're in England, at the time, if you were Catholic, you could be killed for it. But in the colonies, you don't like what's going on. You read your Bible differently. You say, I don't agree. You just go off and you make a new colony like Rhode Island or something, or you go somewhere else and you set up your church there. And that was what was happening in the colonies because of this. And this is called the Great Awakening. Now, we say religious freedom, and what we mean is simply the freedom to kind of practice in the way you choose. The colonies still had religious governments, but new churches begin to organize. And this included even Black Americans and Native Americans in very small groups where they had the freedom and ability to do so. They organized their own churches. In many cases, others even left their churches and set up new places. The two dominant ones were the Anglican, that was the English church, and then the Puritan churches in Massachusetts. And because people could challenge what the beliefs were in one place, they could start to form their own religious beliefs. And that was called the Great Awakening. All right, I've gone on too long, but I'm going to stop there. Stop the recording.